Well, welcome again, everyone. My aim tonight is to encourage you with the Bible that you have in your hand. So I want to give confidence in what we've got in our hands. We're going to get in the next couple of sessions to look at how we interpret and how we really get to grips with what this says. And today I want to deconstruct a little bit and then reconstruct how we get to having this Bible in our hands this evening. So you may have one on a phone or an iPad or actually a physical Bible, but we're going to be looking at that tonight. You've got some notes on your tables. Hopefully you've all got a set of those. But really I'm just suggesting tonight that we've got in our hands the most amazing resource in this Word of God that's here, this Bible that you've got. Probably, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm guessing that we've got English Bibles here. There may be other languages that you speak, but you may have other Bibles, but I'm really basing what I'm talking about on the English Bible. And I just want to help us get back to the original text. So thank you so much, Gareth. I should have remembered that earlier in the evening. Here he comes. Round of applause for Gareth. Thank you, Gareth.
Gareth. Is there another?
Oh.
Right, another one of these.
So, in your Bible, if you've got a copy of the Bible, please do open it. You can pick a page. It doesn't really matter particularly. But you can pick a page, and I just want you to have a note and look at the page. Look at what's on the page. Just have a look and notice what you're seeing in front of you as you look at the page. Now you may have some notes at the bottom, you may have some colouring in, some scribblings, you might have a bookmark somewhere there, but just have a look. What is it you're noticing on the page? What's in front of you?
Lots of black words.
Lots of black words, okay, yeah. There's those. Sorry?
Lots of numbers.
Lots of numbers. Anybody else? Headings, okay. Any tiny little print anywhere?
Yeah.
Right at the bottom. You've got some tiny little print, okay. So, what we want to do to start, we want to get back to what was written and what is the Bible that we're talking about. What's actually the Bible that we're trying to read and understand? So, just to help us here, hopefully this will... It's gone, wonderful. So here's a copy of a page of my Bible. Actually, this was a photo I took of my Bible, so there you go. And it's got a few features in a Bible. They vary, don't they? But of course, what we know is that the centre reference part that I talked about last week isn't original. So John or Luke didn't sit there and put all the references in. So that's not original, they didn't write that. And we know that actually they didn't write the headings in. So John didn't put convenient little headings in to show what he was going to talk about next. We also know that the footnotes weren't original. John didn't put little footnotes in his Bible, in his Gospels. And all of these things are helpful. The section headings that are circled there, they're helpful, but occasionally they're in the wrong place. Just occasionally. There's a very famous one. If you've got a Bible, just turn to Ephesians chapter 5. It's a really famous one. Ephesians 5. And we're going to look around verse 20, 21, that sort of place, 22.
Did you say 21 and 22?
Yeah, that sort of place. So, Ephesians chapter 5. Now, depending on which version you're reading, or depending on where the heading is and what the heading is. So I've got two different Bibles here. Okay. So I've got two Bibles. One of mine, NIV, says Instructions for Christian Households. One of it, New Living, says Spirit-Guided Relationships, Wives and Husbands. You might have either of those, or something different. Now have a look at the verses. What's the next verse that's under that? Verse 21.
20.
in mind has a heading, and then verse 21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. And then it goes on to say, husband, love your wives. NLT says, and further submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. For wives, this means submit to your husbands as the Lord. Now, that hopefully isn't raising too many eyebrows. Except a previous version of the NIV, 1984 version, this is the 2011, had the heading in a slightly different place. So it had the heading after verse 21. So when you got to that passage, you started reading the heading, instructions for Christian households, wives, submit to your husbands, husband loves your wives. You missed off, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. It completely changes the meaning. Completely changes the meaning because you think that you're starting a passage which is going to tell wives to submit to husbands and husbands to love their wives, and actually the whole passage is in the context of submitting to one another. So where you put the headings really makes a difference, and they're not original. They're added in. So they can be really helpful, or they can be disastrous, depending on where you put them. Footnotes, we've covered that. They're not original. Chapter and verses. They're really helpful, aren't they? I can't imagine trying to describe where to find something in the Bible without the chapters and verses. If I'd said to you, let's turn to Ephesians, about 2/3 of the way through, that bit where he's talking about husbands and wives, the bit before then, if I had to say that every time for everything in the Bible, that'd be really complicated. But in your notes it'll tell you that the Old Testament chapters and verses were added by a chap called Mordecai Nathan in 1445, and the New Testament chapter divisions were based on a work by Archbishop Stephen Langton in the early 13th century. And the New Testament verses were based on the work by French writer Robert Estienne in 1551. And sometimes they're in the wrong places. They've tried hard, and you sometimes get a chapter division in the middle of a section, and you think, why divide it there? It's just a funny place to chop the chapter up, and that's because they were doing the best they could, and they thought, well, that makes sense, let's put it in there. And so sometimes there are strange places where you get the chapters and the verses. But they're really helpful, so we're not going to complain too much, but they're not original. So again, the reason I'm saying that is because when you've got a flow of thought that's running, we often start at the beginning of a chapter, or the beginning of a verse, or the beginning of a section, and we start reading there. And it's really helpful sometimes to remind yourself that those artificial divisions are artificial. But actually the author was writing a continuous text that wasn't broken up. And so when you want to really understand what the Bible's saying, you have to go a little bit beyond the artificial numbers that we've inserted to read a bit more of the stream of thought. I hope that's making some sense. So, the headings weren't original either, so John didn't necessarily write John to the top of his Gospel, for example. So then we get down to some text that is what we're actually looking at. Now it gets a little bit more interesting than that. So this is a Hebrew text on the left, Greek text on the right, and this is where it gets really fun. So, the Hebrew text isn't punctuated. There's no punctuation, and actually the original had no vowels. Okay? So you've just got consonants. It's a bit shorter. The vowel signs were added around 7th century BC. Punctuation marks at a similar time. The earliest Greek documents, this is an example of one. This is called uncials. So again, it's written in capital letters, all of this. There's no lowercase letters. And all of this is a continuous stream of text. You notice there's no breaks between the words. So that's how the Greek text was originally written out. That's quite intriguing, isn't it? And you might be thinking, well, how on earth do you read that then? If you've got no vowels, and you've got no punctuation, and in the Greek it's all capitals and all joined up. And how can we trust that what we've got is actually reliable? I don't know if you remember this, about 20 years ago, some of you are old enough to remember this, some of you aren't, but about 20 years ago there was an email that did the rounds that it's not true, but this is what the email said. Do you remember that one? Now, if you're dyslexic, this is going to seem really cruel because you may not be able to decipher it.
Oh, it's better.
Right. But you'll be able to. Can somebody read that out for us?
Yeah.
It says, according to research at researcher at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Remarkable, isn't it? I haven't memorised that, you've just read it with me. That's what it says. Isn't it amazing? And so when the Greek and Hebrew writers were looking at this text, they knew what they were reading. I think actually that may be John's Gospel on that side. I think it says in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was... Anyway, we'll carry on. No, I'm not, because I can... Lowercase I can do, uppercase not so much. So we get back to the text. We want to get back to the text. And I want to just show you that translation's a hard job. Those of you who have done GCSE languages may disagree with me. I'm not very good with languages. I did Greek for 5 years at Bible College, and of my final 8 exams that I need to do for my university degree, 4 of them were in Greek. So that's how heavily I need to do it, and I was still rubbish at it by the end. Because I just had to learn it and learn it and learn it and work really hard, and it took a long time to go into my thick head. And I've forgotten more than I ever knew, I think. But there we go. Translation's hard, and this is because words have slightly different meanings in different languages. If I was to say to you, au revoir, and then ask, what did I say? You might say, well, goodbye. But au revoir has that sense of seeing somebody again, doesn't it? There's that anticipation that it's not a goodbye forever, it's a goodbye with... Is that right? So the words do mean the same, but actually the range of meaning around au revoir is slightly larger than the range of meaning around goodbye. If you're in a culture where there's no word for snow, and you're finding the word snow in the Bible, you've got to find another word to translate that into, to make sense of that in your culture. In the UK, we've got a lot of words for rain. And it's raining, haven't we? If you go to different parts of the country, there's so many different words for rain. Drizzle and mizzle and all sorts of things. But anyway, and so that range of meaning is called the semantic range of a word. And this is really important when you're translating, because words have more than just a direct correlation. There's a semantic range. So for example, I think we've got a little bit of time to do this. Groups at the... Where are we now? I'm going to put up 2 words. I think I might even have this on the screen. Let's have a look. Oh, here we go. Right. This side of the room, I want you to think about the word head. This side of the room, I want you to think about the word fire. And on your tables, you're going to think of different ways of using those words, please. So, for example, fire engine. Or different ways of that one word can be used. Somewhere around there. Yeah. Fire engine. Yeah. Go on, 5 marks there, that's all we need. Industrial.
No, it could be something. Yeah. Head in the game, put your head in the game.
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
Oh,
The room's gone slightly quieter, which means you've either run out of ideas or you're just getting started. So let's enjoy it. Let's just have to enjoy it. Oh, shucks. Let's pause it there. Okay, this side of the room, some different ways that we use the word head. Sorry? Go on, call out, please. Anybody randomly call out. Pointing on this side.
Head lice.
Yeah, so lice. So you're talking about a physical head in that one. Yeah. Okay. Something else. Head of a queue. So at the front of the queue. Yeah. To head out. Setting out somewhere.
Head above water.
Keep your head above water. Okay. Yeah. Can be used metaphorically, or your physical head is actually above water. Yeah. The head of a bed. Yeah. Headline. Okay, I've got a few.
Headmaster.
Headmaster, yeah, go on. What was that one? Toilet on a boat. There we go. Didn't have that one down.
Machine head.
Machine head. So someone might have a good head for business. We talk about head. When you got a coin, you got heads and tails. What's the edible part of a cabbage called? It's weird, isn't it? Or the heart or the head. The person in charge is the head. If you're paying for a meal, you might pay a certain amount per head.
You've got a head hunter.
You're a head hunter. Head of steam. Head off in the direction. Anyway, there's lots on there. You can bite someone's head off. You can be head over heels. Anyway, this side over here.
There's a technical plumbing term as well about how high a pump is.
There is.
You stand your own side.
This side over here for fire. How do you get on with fire?
You're fired.
Yep.
Fireworks.
Fireworks. Okay.
You're on fire.
You're on fire. Oh, come on.
You're fired.
You like my fire? Okay, yeah. Kind of how we feel about things. Yeah, definitely.
There's a song there.
Firefly. Yeah.
You can fire a gun.
You can fire a gun. Yeah.
Extinguisher.
You got so fire a gun to send a bullet somewhere. You got a fire engine, which is to do with actual fire. You can fire a person, not necessarily out of a gun, but you can fire a person. You can have a fiery temper. You can have fiery taste. You can be a passionate person, so you're fiery or full of fire. If you're criticised, you direct your fire at someone, or if someone may have directed their fire at you. You can fire up someone's imagination.
Fire something in a kiln.
Yeah, you can fire something in a kiln. You can indeed. You talk about fire and brimstone, or someone might have been through some struggles. They've been through a fiery time, been through the fire. There's all sorts of ways we can use these two words, and I'm saying that just to show that if you came to a Bible passage and it had the word head in it, or it had the word fire in it, in the Greek or the Hebrew, how do you translate it? What does it mean? You're going to want to notes up. There might be one there. So
It depends what context.
you've got to know what context it's in to be able to understand. Because we understood when we did the wave illustration last week, we knew exactly what it meant when Gareth was waving at you, depending on the context. And so similarly with the words, we need to understand the context. Just to show you the difficulty of this, you may not be able to see this on the screen, and I can't remember for the life of me if it's in your notes or not, but this is 1 John chapter 3 verse 17. Now if you have a Bible, 1 John 3 verse 17 will say something different to what it literally says. So a literal translation is this: whoever has the possessions of the world and sees the brother of him need having and closes the spleen, intestines of him, from him, how the love of God remains in him. So that's complicated, but that's literally word for word what the Greek text says. And then the translators of all these different versions have had to try and work out what does that word in yellow mean. King James, If you see someone in need and you shutteth up his bowels of compassion. NIV, if you see someone in need but have no pity on them. New Living, if you see someone in need but show no compassion. New American Standard, if you see someone in need and close your heart. New King James, you shut up your heart. ESV, you close your heart. Message, you turn a cold shoulder and do nothing. Good News, you close your heart. NRSV, you refuse to help. They're all trying to get to a meaning from a really complicated word which actually talks about shutting up the spleen in Greek. You've got to do something with it. How do you do that? And there's a whole range of methods for this. Similarly, there's another little passage there from 1 Corinthians 7, and the literal one is, if but anyone to be behave dishonourably toward the virgin maiden of him, thinks if he, she getting on in years, and so ought to be what he wills, let him do not, he sins, lets them marry. Now I'm saying all this so that when people say, sometimes people say to me, I want a literal version, I want to know word for what it's saying. That's a literal translation. Good luck. You don't really want a literal version. What you want is somebody that's done a kind of an accurate version that's helped you understand what it meant. And so that word virgin maiden, how do you translate it? King James has virgin, NIV has the virgin he's engaged to, New Living has fiancé, which isn't kind of in the original, but it might be implied, and you've got virgin daughter. There's all these different ways of kind of expressing this one word, and it's a bit complicated. Let's bring it to some words, more words that we're used to using. So if I was to talk about a bachelor, I could be talking about someone who's just at university, or somebody who's not married yet, as a man. Some years ago, if I was to describe somebody as being gay, I would be describing them as being light-hearted, happy and. If I was describing someone as something as awful, it might be literally full of wonder or awe. If, apparently years ago, if you described something as naughty, someone as naughty, now it means that they're badly behaved, but it used to mean had nothing, having nothing. Naughty. Indeed. And decimate, what does that mean? If a population is decimated, we imagine it's been wiped out. Literally, it used to mean you take out 10%. 1 in every 10 people gets killed. That's what the word decimate means. Or does it? So you get these shifts over time. So this is really important when it comes to doing word studies. When you want to look up a word in the Bible and find out what does it mean, it's very easy to do this now. You can look up a word and you can find every occurrence of that word in the Bible. And it's very easy to come up with a theory about what that word means because you've looked it up everywhere. You have to be really careful because it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, just because it appears in lots of places. Be really careful with that. So the Amplified Bible is an example of a translation. We will get to this a bit later on when we look at Bible translations. The Amplified Bible is a combination of a Bible translation plus a Bible dictionary that kind of puts multiple definitions in for a word. Some people find that really helpful. And if it really helps you, that's great. Please keep going with it. If you hear from God from it, please keep using it. But just occasionally it's not so helpful because the author has still had to choose, I've forgotten the lady's name who wrote the Amplified Bible, but there's a woman who wrote it, and she still had to choose the range of meanings for each word that she's got the extra definitions in. So if it said, for example, and this isn't in the Bible, but if it talked about someone being a happy homosexual, it doesn't mean that they are actually a happy homosexual. You can't mean all of them. You've got to pick one of those meanings for the word gay. If you're translating it, for example, it can't mean both, or it doesn't mean both. So just having all the meanings for a particular word against that word doesn't necessarily add clarity. Sometimes it adds confusion. Okay. One of my favourites is to help us with this, to think about this. Sometimes translating from one language into another really doesn't help. So if you were to speak in Cockney, I'm not going to try and do the accent, but you might talk about going up the apples and pears. And which means?
Stairs.
Stairs. I'm going upstairs. We all know that. Okay, so translating that to French for me, and you get something like Je monte la pomme et la poire, which means I'm going up the apples and pears. But if you were to say that to a French person, they'd go, you what? Apples and pears? Really? Because we've translated literally, which has been really unhelpful for them. Which is why when we're reading the Bible and we read about hating your brothers and your mother or your father, or we read about God hating, we stumble over that at times because we think it means despising in your heart. And it doesn't mean that. It's talking about actively, in God's case, he's actively preferring another, he's working with somebody else rather than this other person. That's what it is, a choice that's being evolved. When Jesus is talking about following him rather than kind of going with your parents, it's a choice to follow Christ, not to despise your parents in your heart. So we stumble over these words. Sometimes words and numbers have symbolic meanings in Scripture which we stumble over. What time does this session, this first bit finish? 1:15? Okay. Right. So when you're translating, weights and measures are fun. So you've got to make a choice. Because not all historical weights and measures are consistent. When you're reading the old weights and measures in the Old Testament, sometimes they're used for one amount and another time they might be used for a different amount. So there's a kind of, sometimes there's some inconsistency there. You've also got to pick how you're translating them. Whether you use contemporary money, so some Bibles do this. If you're talking about a denarius, most of our Bibles will translate it into a day's wages. But some will translate it into a monetary amount to give you an idea. But then you get a bit stuck because of inflation and all the rest of it. Do you keep bringing out a new Bible particularly if it's in Argentina and you've got rampant inflation, do you keep bringing out a new Bible all the time to help you? Some are interesting, euphemisms. So this is where, it's less of an issue in the New Testament than the Old, but this is where there's a way of saying something, a bit like we would say going up the apples and pears, which is very different in biblical language times. So, for example, can somebody find, and I hope I've got this reference right, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. And we're looking in this first session before the tea break at how difficult it is, and then in the next bit we're going to look at how brilliant our Bible translations are. Oh, is anyone blushing yet?
1 Corinthians 7:1.
Yes, please.
Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry.
Okay.
Am I right there?
Yeah, that's probably the right one.
But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband.
Okay, let me just... Thank you. So when we actually go to the original text, it says, let me get the right, and I'm cheating, I've got a Greek and English together here in the interlinear. So this is not me pretending I can translate this, but I am just looking it up. It says, and this is again where we're just trying to get an understanding of how difficult it is for the translators. Now about the things you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I'm not going to touch any of you, but if you bumped into someone, is that what he means? No, it isn't. It's talking about having sexual relationships, but the translators have to understand that, because if you're just reading the Greek, you would say it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, that's strange, isn't it? Well, maybe we should step apart a little bit further, have separate cues, just so that you never bump into. You can imagine how, if you've got a religious mindset and you want to take this literally and not offend God and not sin against him, you can end up tripping yourself up with all sorts of extra rules and regulations you're putting in because you're trying really hard to take it literally, a bit like the Pharisees did. One fun one in the Old Testament is the phrase, and forgive me if you speak Hebrew, I will butcher the pronunciation, Eric Apiam, which literally means long of nose. God is described as being long of nose. So if you have a long nose, you are like God. Not because you actually have a long hooter, but because you are slow to anger. So it's a word that's translated being slow to anger. When Potiphar learned, he believed that Joseph tried to sleep with his wife, the Hebrew says his nose burned hot. In the English translations we write his anger burned. And it's a Hebrew saying that his nose was hot. And so if God is long of nose, he's slow to anger, because it takes him a long time for his nose to get hot. It doesn't make much sense to us, which is why the Bible translators have really helped you by translating it for you, so that you don't have every time Gareth having to explain why it talks about God having a long nose every time you read about that. Sometimes there's wordplay, there's jokes, there's metaphor, and there's non-literal meanings in text, and you can read about all that in your notes. Sometimes there's exaggeration. Matthew 24 verse 2, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another, referring to the temple. And yet you go to Jerusalem today and still you see people praying at the Western Wall. Was he lying? No, it's a common Jewish method of speech where you paint a big picture and you tell a story and you push the story out. His parables do that all the time. We really struggle with that with our Western literal mindsets, but it's a Eastern way of talking all the time. Sometimes we get confused with what have I done? Sometimes we get confused with, where are we? Gender. So sometimes, the Bible will talk about brothers, and some Bible translations just translate brothers, and others, more modern ones, will translate brothers and sisters, because the word is being used inclusively, and that's quite important. We all want to be involved in that. Sometimes we struggle. Does anybody get struggle with the Bible names any time? Yeah. I've done this for years, reading through the Old Testament, and you think you're reading about Israel, and you're not quite sure which bit of Israel you're reading about. Because it's a word that's used so many different ways at so many different times. And I remember reading through Kings and Chronicles and getting really confused whether it was the North or the South Kingdom I was reading about. And actually did a preach once, and I'll never do this again, but I did it once. It felt like a good idea at the time. And we went through, for people, who the kings were in different nations and who the prophets were that were speaking to the kings in different nations. And I had people on stage with bits of paper for the king, with names on for the king, and who, because it's so baffling, isn't it? And we tried to map all this out, and I'm not sure it went as well as I thought it would, but it felt good at the time. So some of the names that we get are interesting. So when you read Pharaoh, it's not a person, it's a title, like king or queen. Abimelech is another one, which is the family name of the kings of Philistia. Ben-Hadad's another one, used by the Syrian kings. Caesar's another one. And I think I may have given you a little picture in your notes of Herod. And when you're reading about Herod, this is brilliant. Because you think, oh yeah, Herod, that bloke. But I'm not giving you this one. Not to worry. So Herod, you can look this up yourselves. It will be on Google somewhere. You might be reading about Herod the Great, or Herod Philip, or Herod Antipas, or a different Herod Philip, or Herod Agrippa, or Herod Agrippa II.
Nice and easy.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, just like that.
So, which is why sometimes the little commentaries you get, little study Bibles, are really helpful, because they'll just unpack for you. By the way, this is Herod number 17, or this is Herod this one. And then explain a little bit of what's going on. Or you can speak to Gareth and he'll explain it all.
It is in the notes from the bits that I did before.
There you go, brilliant. Sometimes you get other multiple people with the same name. So this is not, this is actual names. So James, there's a couple of those. Philip, there's a couple of those. Mary, there's so many Marys, aren't there, in the Gospels? And you scratch your head thinking, now which Mary's this? Sometimes we have, there we go, different people with the same name. Sometimes we have the same people with different names.
Yes.
Jethro will be one. Moses' father-in-law, also called Reuel. Matthew, who's also called Levi. Paul, who's also called Saul. Bonus point, extra biscuit. Can anyone tell me when Paul's name changed? Saul's name changed. It sounds like a trick question, doesn't it? Yeah. It sounds like a trick question because the answer most of us have been programmed with is when he became a Christian. When he saw the vision on the Damascus road, God changed his name from Saul to Paul. Except he didn't. And if you go to the book of Acts, chapter 13, verse 9, you'll see that Paul is called Saul and Saul is called Paul. And it's only when he's sent out on mission that he's called Paul. And the reason is because he's always had two names, and he keeps having two names even after he's gone out on mission. He doesn't stop being Saul, he's Paul and Saul. One's a Hebrew name, one's a Greek name. So when he's going out on mission, he's Paul, because that's his Greek name. But to his mates back at home, he's still Saul. He doesn't stop being one or the other. And so it's a lovely sermon. Sorry for ruining your sermons. That's what I'm here to do, ruin all your sermons. It's a lovely sermon. So God didn't change Paul's name. I'm really sorry if you've ever heard that preached. Have you? Yeah, okay. God didn't change Paul's name. He had two all the way through. Jesus had multiple names. Did you know that? Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of Galilee, Jesus ben Joseph, Jesus the carpenter. All of those are Jesus' names. There are some other words which are really important ones. Really important ones. I'll just pause on these for a moment before we do break. When we're reading about salvation, sometimes the Bible is talking about some kind of spiritual experience, a salvation that we might often talk about it. But very often it's talking about a much more holistic experience. It's talking about us being rescued. And there's a danger that we read the Bible with our Greek, Platonic, Western mindset. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. You'll read it like a person in Folkestone will read it. And you'll go, oh, so I'm saved. That's what it means. It means a bit of me inside somewhere goes to heaven when I die. That's what being saved is all about. But biblically, being saved is much more holistic than that. It's about you as a whole being, you being rescued. You've been redeemed, all of you. In part of a creation that's being redeemed. And we've got this idea that a bit of us floats off somewhere when we die. We're not quite sure, and it feels all very intangible. And you hear people talking about St. Peter greeting you at the gates, and you see these pictures of angels with harps on clouds, and you think, and people talk to you and they say, well, I don't really think I want to go there. I'd rather go to the other place. I'm not surprised because of the way we've described it. But when the Bible's talking about being saved, it's talking about the whole of us. All of us being redeemed and rescued. And so the word means different things at different times. You have to be a little bit careful when you're reading. Israel's a great one. Occasionally in our kind of church, people will, and I know nothing about your sensibilities here, so I'm going to just step out and hope for the best. Particularly in the current political climate that we're in, people will say to you, what do you think about Israel? It's a really loaded question, isn't it? So my answer is always, which one? And they go, what? And I never win friends this way, but it gets me out of giving an opinion. To which I then say, which one? Do you mean the person, Jacob, who became Israel? God did change his name. Do you mean him? Do you mean Jacob's family, because they were called Israel? Do you mean all 12 tribes of Israel? Do you mean God's chosen people? Do you mean the land Israel that they went to? Do you mean the 10 northern tribes when they'd split off from the southern ones, because we had Judah in the south, the 2 in the south, then we have Israel in the north, the 10 northern tribes. Do you mean them? Or do you mean the remaining inhabitants when the northern kingdom had gone, because then the southern kingdom gets called Israel? Do you mean the people who go off into exile and then come back, because they get called Israel? Do you mean those Jewish people who get spread around the world, because they get called Israel? All this is in the Bible, by the way. Or do you mean the true Israel, which is those that trust in God, even when it includes people like me who aren't Jewish, because we get added in to God's people? That's amazing, isn't it, that we get added in? Isn't that cool? Not to replace, but to be added into the people. Do you mean the remnant of the Jewish people? Or do you mean the current nation state or the current political entity? Which one do you mean? And by that stage, they've fallen asleep. But all of that just to show that when someone asks you a simple question, when you're reading or asked an opinion about a simple thing, when you're reading a key word in the Bible, there's a huge amount that's going on behind those key words. And you can have great confidence that the Bible translators are working really hard to do the best they can, to present you a text that you can understand, that's meaningful. And we'll get on to that after you've had a cup of tea. So there we go.